Hello, class. It's Mr. Karavlan here, Mr. K to some of you. Let's talk about how to improve your constructed responses. I've enjoyed reading these, and I've enjoyed grading most of them. Today I'm going to talk about the things you're doing well and the things you're not doing so well, and how we can improve on all facets of constructed responses. Of course, you recently read the excerpt from Chapter 14 of Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle. Upton Sinclair, a muckraker, which you've learned about during your studies of the Progressive Era, wrote in great detail on the American meatpacking industry. Quote, "It was only when the whole ham was spoiled that it came into the department of Elizabetta, cut up by the 2,000 revolutions and minute flyers and mixed with half a ton of other meat. No odor that ever was in a ham could make any difference. There was never the least attention paid to what was cut up for sausage. There would come all the way back from Europe old sausage that had been rejected and that was moldy and white. It would be dosed with borax and glycerin and dumped into the hoppers and made over again for home consumption. There would be meat that had tumbled out onto the floor, in the dirt and sawdust where the workers had tramped and spit uncounted billions of consumption germs. There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and the water from leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race about on it. You get the picture." On a positive note, you've done an excellent job with your thesis statements. As a class, there's very few of you who will find that you lost points for your thesis. While not all are perfect, you've all done a good job of responding to the prompt. Remember with your thesis statement that your thesis must contain the language of the prompt. In fact, this makes it easier. All you need to do is observe the prompt and find a way to work that into your thesis statement. Your thesis should really be an answer to the prompt. And if you're answering the prompt, you should include the language of the prompt. The prompt for this constructive response, was to analyze the early 20th century problems of the meat industry. And then we asked you to use examples from the passage for your analysis. So you need to mention in your thesis the 20th century problems of the meat industry. Pay attention and go the extra mile and make sure to include all elements of your argument in your thesis. Let me show you an example of some good student work. This young lady or boy, I won't say, wrote, "There were many problems in the meat industry during the 20th century. However, only one main problem stood out in this passage: meat contamination and safety, period." That's great. You might notice a little bit of awkward phrasing in there, but this student lost no points here. Her thesis, well, I guess I should tell you, this was a young lady. Her thesis restates, contains the language of the prompt, talks about the problems in the meat industry. She claims that there are many of them. She then goes on to make the argument in the thesis that the main problems that stood out were meat contamination and safety. So now I know that when I read a constructive response, I'm going to see evidence on meat contamination and evidence on safety. Excellent job. Following your thesis, you should concern yourself with finding evidence or examples in the work, the primary source, that can support your thesis. So if your thesis concerns the 20th century problems of the meat industry, you need to find evidence to talk about those problems. Remember, your examples should be relevant. They have to be relevant to your thesis. They have to make sense. They have to prove your thesis. And if your thesis is there are problems in the meat industry, then you need to have evidence of the problems. If your thesis specifically concerns an aspect of those problems, then you need to have evidence that applies to that. Your examples should be relevant. Also, please include specific information from the passage. You have primary source materials here. Please directly quote them. Sometimes you can paraphrase, but for this small constructive response, use the quotes, use the material, use the hard evidence in front of you. Let me show you a good example of this. Now this is a different student, but it's still quality work. And you notice this student picks the quote at the beginning, at the top of the page here, the excerpt I've shown you. Quote, "There would be meat that had tumbled out on the floor in the dirt and sawdust where the workers had tramped and spit uncounted billions of consumption germs." End quote. Now, on a side note, consumption is tuberculosis. You guys all have had your TB vaccines. At this time in the early 20th century, late 19th century, it was known as consumption because slowly your body died and rotted away. It looked like you were being consumed from the inside. You'd be rather skeletal at the end. Anyways, great, vivid quote. And a lot of you guys have done a good job of pulling out good quotes. All right, but that is only 1/3, right? You've got 1/3 of your grade comes from your thesis, 1/3 comes from your examples, and 1/3 comes from your analysis. So we're doing decent with the thesis. We're seeming to pick out good examples, but then some of us are dropping the ball when it comes to analysis. There is a very simple structure we should remember. We should remember that we need to have our thesis, a piece of evidence, then analysis of that evidence before we move on to a second piece of evidence. Thesis, evidence, analysis, evidence, analysis. That is what you need. Many of us had a thesis, evidence, more evidence, evidence. No analysis. And that is where you will notice on the rubric that many of you lost points. Right? Your analysis needs to be clear, complete, and connected to the argument. By clear, make it simple. Explain to the reader how this evidence applies to your thesis. Make it complete. Don't leave anyone guessing. The reader shouldn't have to guess at what you mean. Tell us what you mean. Spell it out. And make sure, again, that it's connected to the argument, that it's clear and we can understand it, that it's complete and you haven't left anything out, and that you connect it back to the argument. The argument is your thesis. The argument is that there's problems in the 20th century meatpacking industry. Connect back to it. Let's look at a piece of student work here. As we look at these last two examples of student work, I want you to recognize that these aren't perfect. Okay, they have maybe some spelling errors or punctuation errors or maybe some awkward phrasing, but ultimately they accomplish what you need to do. They have set out a thesis, they've followed it up with an example that is relevant and specific from the passage, and then they have analysis that is clear, complete, and connected to the argument, connected to their thesis. So let's look at this first example. After this student quotes about the meat that had tumbled onto the floor and into the sawdust and covered with the tuberculosis, they then analyze it by saying, this problem put people in danger because people are going to be eating contaminated meat with germs. It also shows how the workers are not paying attention. Okay. Now, is that analysis perfect? No, it's a little bit awkward in phrasing, but I'm asking you to do this within one period on a certain amount of time, and so I know sometimes we rush. But this student does point out that by dropping the meat onto the floor, it puts people in danger, that it shows that the workers are not paying attention. Okay, so the connection is to the 20th century problems in the meat industry, that people are going to get sick, that the workers aren't doing a good job. Those are the problems in the 20th century industry. Then the student goes on to say that there's no place for the men to wash their hands before they eat their dinner. And you get another good example, and then the student goes on to talk about the cleanliness and the dangers. So again, thesis, evidence, analysis, evidence, analysis. Two pieces of evidence, and then analyze both of them. Let's look at the next example. There was never the least attention paid to what was cut up for sausage. This is a quote I read to you before. Also using the very vivid description of the hoppers and things of that nature in the tuberculosis-ridden floors. But then comes the analysis. You see here in the center of the page, from this quote, we can see one of the many reasons why meat contamination was a problem for meat industries. Companies would literally put anything into the hopper to be ground up with the meat because they were too lazy to care. The workers put moldy meat and chemicals into the grinders, and the sausage would be sent to family homes, resulting in everybody getting sick. So, this student connects the evidence, analyzes the evidence, and connects it directly back to the thesis, saying this quote shows us why there is problems with meat contamination. Then tells us what that meat contamination could do. All right. As you read further here, the student writes, the author states, quote, it was too dark in these storage places to see well, but a man could run his hand over the piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of dried dung of rats. End quote. Dung obviously being poop. Again, we see how the workers were too lazy to care. So again, this student immediately goes into the analyzation. It's not enough to give us a thesis and evidence. Sure, we can make sense on our own of like, okay, he or she, the student put this thesis down and then listed some evidence and we get the connection. But that's not enough. You need to connect them. And look at your rubrics. A lot of you are going to see you did well on your thesis, you did well on your examples, and then fell off on the analysis. Either it was missing or off topic, or it was only partially connected to the argument. It's not hard to find examples that are relevant, but you have to tell us why those examples are relevant, why those examples connect back to your thesis. So thank you for your time. Again, remember, thesis, example, analysis, second example, second analysis. That's the key. These constructed responses are done in a limited amount of space. They can be anywhere from 5 to 15 sentences. You aren't writing some endless tome. You are making an argument with your thesis that completely contains the language of the prompt, that addresses all elements of the argument. You are then providing an example that is relevant, using specific information, aka use a quote. Then you're analyzing that. You're analyzing it clearly, completely, and accurately, and you're connecting the evidence to the argument that you made. And then you're doing it again. Thesis, example, analysis, example, analysis. Thank you for your time. Good luck.